And historic season wrapped up. It's Scarlet and Gray, Ohio State, the national champion. How did the 12-team playoff go? What might we change if given the opportunity to wave that proverbial magic wand? This is the College Game Day podcast for Wednesday, January 22nd. Rece Davis and Ryan McGee here. Pete Thamel having the old vocal cords recover after working every nook and cranny of the national championship game to unearth information. And what a spectacular job Pete did over the course of the season, not only on this podcast, but certainly on College Game Day as well. So, Ryan, we got a lot to get to, but we do, as we come to the end of the season, want to thank all of you who've listened to the show, who've made it possible. We appreciate the support and all of the people who have subscribed and the kind words that we've gotten from coaches, from players and fans who've listened, and we appreciate all of it. We do want to make sure that we're talking about all of the things that you are interested in. So we have put together a nifty little survey, and I know how much you love hearing that. Would you be willing to stay on the line to answer a few questions at the end of our discussion? If you would, the powers that be, the suits here at ESPN, would certainly like to hear your feedback. It's only 8 questions, take you a few minutes to fill out. The link will be in the description of the episode. And if I haven't seen it yet, but if there's anything in the comments, but I really like those recent Ryan guys, and Pete too, for that matter. McGee, what did you think? I haven't had a chance to talk to you since the national championship game. Before the game, I said, if it comes down to the end, Notre Dame will win by a field goal. Otherwise, it'll be 42-17, Ohio State. And we got a little mix of that for a while. I thought the biggest surprise I had was that, and some of it was aided by Ohio State, but the biggest surprise that I had was that Notre Dame got back into the game. That's their credit. To their credit, fought their tails off, never quit, which was a great reflection of their character and their leadership from Marcus Freeman. But in the end, it was largely as scripted, with the Buckeyes dotting that I in script Ohio, pun intended, and winning the national championship.
Yeah, it was, and you know this when you're in the press box, right? And I'm not in the press box a lot anymore because I'm usually downstairs and we're doing TV or whatever. But in the press box, there's a moment where I always go back to the national championship in New Orleans with LSU and Clemson. Early in the third quarter, I looked at my editors and went, "Can I start writing?" Because that game was over. And we had that exact same conversation. We at halftime, it's like, all right, if Ohio State opens with a touchdown, I'm going to start writing. And I start writing, and the McGee curse kicked in, and all of a sudden I look up, and it's an 8-point football game. But I give Notre Dame credit because, that opening drive that Notre Dame had was one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed in person when it comes to football.
Never seen anything like it. Nobody's ever seen anything like it.
It was Army. It was a total, Army, Jeff Monken, let's just use it the entire quarter drive. And the reality is, and Marcus Freeman said as much when the game was over with, when that happened, I think it all, and I'm always very wary, and I know you are too, of the great opening drive because you've had that scripted for a minute.
It's your script, and everybody's jacked up, and you've probably thrown a few blocking assignment wrinkles at them. You've used quarterback run, all of those things that it's not that they didn't anticipate it, but they're seeing it for the first time. So I agree.
Yeah, but you also knew there's no way that Riley Leonard can do that for the next 4 hours. Otherwise we're going to be carrying him out of there. And so, but the next couple of drives ended with self-inflicted wounds, and the momentum went away. And then meanwhile, this Chip Kelly that we've all been waiting on all year, who suddenly showed up, for the Tennessee game and never showed any sign of slowing down. It really felt like a blowout, but I give Notre Dame credit because there were a lot of times, the building certainly, and I'm certain, and the television audience at home, based on social media, everyone else was checking out, and Notre Dame never did. So I give them a lot of credit for that. But yeah, the best team, certainly the best team we saw once we hit December, just won the national championship.
I think that they were the team with the highest ceiling from start to finish, and they hit it at the right time. There were a number of things that you think about the impact of that. And I had a conversation, did the conversation for SportsCenter and the various entities with Ryan Day on Tuesday morning. And one of the things that he sort of dodged the first time, and I had to hit him the second time, The Michigan game has changed. All rivalry games have changed with the expansion of the playoff. It doesn't mean that they're unimportant. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be gut-wrenching and heartbreaking to lose those games, but they are no longer, for playoff contenders, existential crisis every time you lose the game. Because we have this example, and Nick Saban has cited several times the 2017 example also in that stadium. Nobody outside of Auburn fans remembers or cares that that Alabama team lost to Auburn. Because they came back and Tua didn't play against Auburn, but he was playing by the end of the Georgia game and he won the game. And I'm not going to say it's going to be that extreme that nobody's ever going to remember that Ohio State lost to Michigan, because that is what is going to keep. And I know you're a good person to talk to about this with your appreciation and knowledge of history and being able to contextualize things that happen in the sport. The Michigan game is going to keep Ohio State from being among the all-time great champions. They're just going to be a champion, and because the 1-point loss at Oregon that you avenged against the number one team all year, I don't think that necessarily precludes you from being one of the all-time greats. Losing to an average Michigan team is a 3-touchdown favorite at home does. And it doesn't change the trophy. There's no extra trophy for being among the all-time greats. It's just when ESPN does, CFB 200, this team will just be in the champions category. It won't be in the category of all-time greats. And, that's not a real thing anyway. I mean, the real thing is the trophy. So these rivalry games now have changed. And some would argue maybe it's for the better, because, the flip side of it is that people really cared about Arizona State and BYU late in the season. Otherwise, they might not have. So it's been different and will be different.
Well, we keep going back, or at least I keep going back to basketball comparisons, because, what we're trying to do, and this has been stated in these words, is what we're trying to do is we're trying to inject some March Madness into college football. And, when you were inviting more teams and when everyone has a chance, and it felt like that when we got to the middle of November, because now it's elimination games, and now it's all right, do this, and now what are you doing in your conference tournament? Does that matter or doesn't it? It's all these things that are happening. And then part of that is, I grew up in North Carolina. The Duke North Carolina game still happens, the last game of the regular season, and then the ACC tournament starts a few days later. The ACC tournament doesn't mean what it did when I was growing up. Doesn't mean it doesn't mean less to them. They still get a ring, right? You certainly want to win it. That
if they're giving out a trophy, we want it.
Yeah. Right? But that last North Carolina Duke game, there's certainly no less emotion attached to that than there ever has been, but it doesn't mean as much on paper, because in the reality, and what's going to be amazing, because it's coming, is when we have an Auburn and Alabama, or a Michigan and Ohio State, or give me any of those, and then they're going to play again in the playoff. And that's when I can't wait for, when we're playing those twice. So but it's hard to tell. The story I wrote was, and I talked today, and I talked to these guys about, okay, you said this wasn't about revenge and about, quite frankly, telling your fan base to shut up, because they wouldn't shut up about the Michigan game when I was there for the first round game against Tennessee. Now I want to know what that feels like this winter. Are people still? Is there still an asterisk in the minds of all those fans? And in the end, it doesn't matter because they got a ring. But I just want to know.
You know what, Ryan? I want to be careful how I say this, which I often am, because I don't like the knee-jerk overreaction stuff to all of this. What Ryan Day went through in terms of when you have to post a security guard at your house, it's inexcusable behavior, certainly by a small number of people. And I'm not talking about Ohio State contributing to that small number of, threats, whether they were real or just, irrational, angry messages, whatever it might be. But the whole feeling of Michigan being everything, of the be-all, end-all, Ryan Day didn't start that, but he certainly contributed to it. And that's why I find it so interesting about how, as he is the leader of this program, now that he has a different platform, The Ohio State head coach always has a platform. The national championship winning Ohio State coach has a different and larger and more powerful platform that can be used for a number of ways. And the thing that I'm really fascinated by is in the offseason, how does it impact the way they address Michigan? I've told this story on this podcast several times. When Ryan joined us before the Indiana game and he talked about the objectives, the first thing he mentioned was beat our rival. They were about to play Indiana.
Yeah.
Indiana was undefeated. And I don't mean to suggest for 1 second that they weren't focused on Indiana. They were. They were obviously the way they played. I'm just saying that in their mental approach to football, to their program, to their culture, first thing on the list, at least the first thing mentioned, was Michigan. I think that needs to change. Now, that's up to him. He has the trophy. I don't. But I think it would be healthier for all involved if it changed it. Do we want to beat them? Yes. Do we want the goal bench? Yes. Do we want to rub it in their face? Yes. All of those things that make rivalry in college football great. But that at the expense of everything else, or at least that everything else somehow falls beneath it when you talk about it, I think Ohio State has had an object lesson in why that is not as important. I mean, they'd love to have both. There will be years that they have both. There will probably be years that Michigan has both the victory and the championship. That's obviously the number one objective. But when you start stating things like that, it's almost like the reason they kept getting asked about Michigan was because of the way they've treated Michigan.
Right.
So now I think that one of the necessities of this 12-team playoff, and frankly, probably one of the costs, is that all teams with these gargantuan rivalries, they're great. We should cherish them. They need to be protected. But they can't be the be-all, end-all existential crisis of the program. The sky is going to fall on the program if we don't beat insert arch rival here, particularly among those teams who are going to be competing for the national championship.
Yeah, because when you go in the building, because we don't, just so everyone understands what we're saying here, we're not talking about rivalries don't mean as much and it shouldn't be emotional. We're not saying that at all. But
they need to mean something, but there's life after it, is what I'm saying.
Perhaps maybe you don't need to have 17 digital clocks in the building that are all, as we speak, already counting down to the next Michigan game. I think I've told this story on the pod before. When I was a student at Tennessee, and this is in the early 90s, and Tennessee was in the middle of an 8-year losing streak to Alabama, and it was the only week that you would go into like the men's room, and while you were doing what you do in the men's room, you're having to stare at a wall of photocopied Alabama logos. And during practice all week, they're playing the Alabama fight song over and over and over, not for noise, not to get you ready for crowd noise, just to get on your nerves and to remind you of the game. And as a result, I'll never forget it. At Legion Field, prior to the game, and I believe it was Carl Pickens, who I tried to see in Atlanta over the weekend. It just didn't work out. But Carl Pickens, a bunch of guys looking at us and going, "We're just ready to get this over with." Mm-hmm. And you don't want to get it to that point, right? Your kid's not going to eat broccoli because you make them eat a bowl of broccoli every night. It's just but you're right. It's dialing it back just a little bit, because again, going back to Duke, North Carolina, there's not. It's hard to find more dislike anywhere in the world between two athletic programs, but there's no clocks in the building, right? You can still do it. So yeah, it's going to be really, really, you say it wisely all the time, which is, this is what it is now. What is all this going to look like 10 years from now? Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to see 10 years from now. Rivalry weekend's not going away, and the intensity of it's not going to go away, but perhaps it's not the end all be all. And Ohio State might already just set that tone for everybody for forever.
You know what, Ryan, and I think to sum this up, and we'll move from it. It's really fun to do that. It's part of the fabric of college football. It's fun to play the fight song in the building, the countdown clock in Ohio State till the next Michigan game is fun. And I don't mean like, ha ha. I mean, it's great. It's part of, jacking guys up. But the moment it becomes too much is when it impedes performance.
Right.
And you were talking about the Tennessee story that you had, and I would argue that based on recent evidence that it has impeded performance for Ohio State. So now that's when you adjust, is you adjust what's the perspective on it. How do you think moving past that, I've got a few things I've written down here. 12-team playoff, future of the sport as it pertains to the playoff, because there are those in the sport, maybe this is for another podcast another day, who believe that the 12-team playoff and the excitement over it and the access that other teams have to it is masking a lot of ills, and that price is going to have to be paid at some point. But just as it pertains to the play on the field and the structure of the playoff, how did you think it go? What would be the first change you would make?
Well, I've been trying to get rid of the buys since the first time we found out we had 12 teams. Like I just, and clearly that was not an advantage for anyone because they were all gone as soon as they started playing. So I just,
So we're all the conference champions.
yeah,
Conference champions.
I get very sensitive about college football looking too much like the NFL, right? I'm not. I respect the NFL. They're players I follow. You know, God bless the Carolina Panthers. They're my team. But I don't live and die by NFL. Never have. I'm a college football guy, and so I want to make sure that there's enough that separates those two sports. And just by nature, there's always going to be that. But trying to become NFL light is a bad move because now you're just giving me what I'm already getting the very next day. And so I've ever since we were going to expand the playoff, I was at give me 8 or give me 16. I think 16 is where you go. You know, that's how I grew up watching Division II, watching FCS, postseasons back in the day. But that's the number. It feels like that might be too many. But it's better than 12 in my opinion. And obviously the reseeding. I mean, I don't lose a lot of sleep over that like a lot of people seem to. But to me, it's the buys because the beauty of college football is if you're going to win the championship, I want you to play the same number of games that the other team did, with the exception of maybe a conference championship game. You know, but I want you to have to experience the same December and January that your opponent did.
I The number one thing I would do for the current format, I do have a problem with the seating. And the reason you talked about them trying to make it a little too much like the NFL is because they structure the format in a very NFL fashion, treating the conference champions sort of like the NFL treats division champions, as if all of them are equal or relatively equal. And there's a greater disparity among conferences in college football than there are divisions in the NFL. And I realize AFC South, is not the NFC North, although we also have seen how that's worked out in the NFL playoffs for the NFC North teams. And it's probably a testament to the fact that there's less disparity. There's less of a gap. So your reward to me is getting in the field, then just seed the bracket because Oregon was given a more difficult path than Penn State. Let's leave Ohio State out of it for the moment. Ohio State, had a difficult path, navigated it, won a championship. That's an awesome thing. But Penn State lost to both of them and had a more favorable path to advance into the bracket. That needs to be fixed. And then if teams, it doesn't, and I've said this every time because people always overreact and say, well, look at this team won and that team won and other conference champions got there. That's true. It doesn't mean they can't win the games. It doesn't mean that whoever's seeded 11th or 12th in a true seed type of thing, that doesn't mean they can't win. Of course they can. But what the seeding should reflect is what has happened and your evaluation of those teams up to that point. And what they do after that is up to them. But what I would do is not going to happen, but it needs to. Boy, Ryan Day made an unbelievable point in our conversation the other day, and I hadn't thought of it in this context. He was talking about the length of the season, and I told him what I'd said earlier in this podcast about the enhanced platform when you win a championship and the good of college football. And he said, think of it this way. We started before any NFL team, and we played longer than all but 4 of them.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that for a minute.
Yeah, that's
So
amazing.
here's what I would suggest. I know people are saying let's try to play the championship game on New Year's Day. You can't get there in an enhanced field. What I would say is expand to 16. Everybody starts at week 0, and you do away with conference championship games. Because once you get to 16, the conference championship games, even in the great competitive environment that is the SEC championship, the SEC championship game, and hats off, obligatory hats off to the Big Ten. They're the top dog in college football right now in the last 2 years. But the best championship game since they've started, and none of them have captured that magic, is the SEC. And the SECs will be who you have to arm wrestle and full steel cage match fight to lose the SEC championship game. But it is going to diminish over time too, like some of these other rivalry things that we're talking about. So if I could wave the magic wand, and we would have to negotiate with media partners because that revenue has to be replaced. I understand that. Revenue must be replaced, if not enhanced. I would start the season at week 0. I would try to find a way to generate the revenue to maybe even, if you don't want to start week 0, then go back to 11 games instead of 12. But I'd prefer 12 and start at week 0. And then when you reach conference championship week, you're playing the first round of the playoff instead. And now instead of, 3, 4 games with me, now you've got 8 on that weekend. Somewhere in December, I also still on campus, play the next round, the quarters, and then you move to the bowl sites, and that would probably get you finished a week to 10 days earlier in January, and would also leave you with 2 giant semifinals on New Year's Day. That's what I would. That's what I
Yeah,
would do
I like it.
structurally. That's what I would do structurally if you could. I
Yeah.
understand the difficulties, and the number one difficulty with all of that is our conference championship games. And I don't. I mean, that's going to be a ways down the road. I do think something similar to that will eventually happen, but as fast as this sport has moved the last few years, historically, it's moved more like a battleship. Takes a while to turn it, sort of like the golf cart that Ryan Day and the Buckeyes were on in the bowels of the stadium the other night, and it will run into a wall or an iceberg. So it's going to take a while, but I actually think that would work. It would condense the season a little bit. The business aspect of it of replacing the revenue, the idea of not having the conference championship game, and I think along with that, you would want to mandate similar schedules, something that James Franklin has talked about. Maybe if you do that, then everybody plays 9 conference games. Maybe 11 of your 12 are within, the Power Four structure. And then within that too, you'd have to decide whether the teams outside that Power Four structure are included or not. And that's a necessity. I don't know. Because if you then say, okay, I'm going to replace conference championship games with high level games to enhance the television media rights revenue, whether you use streamers or whatever to get that revenue back. Well, I've got to have a good product. I've got to have high level product that people want to watch. And then you have to decide who, how many, which of those teams that are outside the Power Four structure are included in that. And probably there will come a time you'll have to decide which within the Power Four structure are included. Although this year was a very good example of how teams that you would think of immediately long term, if you were saying, okay, all of these teams aren't going to make it into the proverbial Super League someday. Prior to this year, Indiana and Arizona State would have been way up on the list, particularly Indiana. Arizona State's always been viewed as the sleeping giant. If somebody could finally figure out how to get it right, that they could be good. But Indiana particularly would have been high on the list of what do they bring to the table. And we found out this year, if you get the right guy and you do it the right way with using the portals effectively as Signetti did, that there's value there too. So, a very long, comprehensive plan. So whenever they come and say, hey, we're going to cede all of our power to you, Rece Davis, fix this thing.
Yeah.
This is what we'll do first.
So I started the season. I wrote a story for ESPN.com about, all right, so Nick Saban is on TV now. Who is the face of college football? And when I watched your conversation with Ryan Day, I thought that guy right there is on the list now. because when I talked to Dan Lanning, he didn't want it. When I talked to other guys, they don't want it. But Ryan Day, there's things he's wanted to say, and I love your take there. What I worry about, and you mentioned this, and maybe this is an entire other podcast, is there. And to be clear, the SEC being guaranteed 4 spots in the playoff, and the SEC, it's all great for Marty McGee. I want to make sure you understand that, but I don't know that it's great for college football. And what you're talking about masking things, that at the top level, everything's great. But when I talk to the mid-major level, it isn't great. And it's not just about losing players in the transfer portal and feeling like you're the AA affiliate of whatever. It's also just about attendance, and it's about keeping your fans engaged, because the reality is that's a level where you rely on some TV money, but you rely on gate, and you rely
Mm-hmm.
on merch, and you rely on, the loyalty of, say, the fan base in an Appalachian State,
Mm-hmm.
places that feel like they're being left behind. And I'm not naive. I understand what runs things. And again, it's great for me, great for ESPN, all those things. But the concern, and I've had these conversations with Kirby Smart and with Nick Saban and with, Dabo and Jimbo and everybody who's made the most money at the top level. And they all worry about it too, because at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day, Kirby still loves Valdosta State, right? I mean, Nick Saban still loves Kent State. Jimbo still loves Samford. It's important for college football that it be healthy at every level, no matter how that affects or doesn't affect, and it won't, the very top level. So that's why, as we expand the playoff, there has to be a place, and it can't just be the gratuitous give them 1 spot at the end, the at-large of the New Year's Six Bowl equivalent to the future. I worry about that, and maybe I'm just naive and Pollyanna and whatever else, but there has to be some health at those other levels, because the trickle-down effect is, if you raid the mid-majors and now nobody goes to that, well, then they raid FCS, who raids Division II, and there's a danger in that, because if every level of football isn't playing college football, then I just worry about that, because it's not just about you know the top 30 teams in the nation.
I just don't know how you go back. And I'm not saying, when I say these things, Ryan, it's almost from a realistic standpoint, because I agree with you. Like, the National Football Foundation's mission is to try to grow and ensure the health of the game across all levels. And I believe in that. A lot of people come out of their football experience. Look, I mean, look at the great story that our buddy Marty Smith just did on Tiger Besh,
Yep.
football player at Princeton, terrific player at Princeton, was working on Wall Street, had developed these connections. It wasn't all because of football. A lot of it was Princeton, but it certainly enhanced his connections. My son has baseball teammates from Princeton who are working in front offices of major league organizations. They're working for Major League Baseball itself. There are guys. Talked about this for a while. There are guys who played for Holtz at Notre Dame, who I was with just a couple of weeks ago. Football and those connections have lasted them a lifetime. He had a football player who was, one of the highest ranking members of the Secret Service, guys who are titans of industry and, barons of the boardroom, who also scored touchdowns against Miami in '88,
Yeah.
and so there are, and I know those are probably tough examples because Notre Dame's Notre Dame, but that's still true at other levels too, that connections made, experiences, things that football and all sports can teach you need to be protected. And if you don't have those opportunities, and you don't have them. But I think that horse is out of the barn at the highest level. And so the challenge for the lower levels is, how do we make this attractive? How do we survive? And there's also a problem at the highest level. And I know Nick got some criticism for this, but he was talking about the disparity in the payrolls. Everybody made such a big stinking deal about Ohio State's $20 million. You know what $20 million is going to be next year? Upper middle class.
Right.
It's not going to be the wealthiest. There are
Right.
people who are zooming past that, and I'm sure Ohio State will hop on trains so that
Right.
nobody passes them. So college football is college in name only. Student athlete is a term, an archaic term that's a ridiculous one that was made up years and years ago to shield the colleges from workman's compensation claims, period. So, this idea that this is some type of, it's ingrained in these superior, high-minded motives is a farce. It was a business then. It's a business now. The college football is a level of professional football. When the quarterback is getting paid $3 million, he is a professional.
He is.
Period.
He is.
So when you have a professional enterprise, you've got to have some collective bargaining. And Nick and I were talking about this before the game in the room. I said, I think collective bargaining is the only way out. And he agreed. And I said, but here's the problem. Who bargains with whom?
Right.
Who represents the players?
Right.
Because they don't want them unionized. And I agree with that. That could be a problem. It could be a problem because not just for the people on the other side, it's a problem for the union because I'm getting into some areas where I have just enough knowledge to be dangerous. Let me acknowledge that. But unions typically, from the people I talk to, they don't love it when their membership turns over constantly.
Right.
And by definition in college football, even though it's professional, your membership is going to constantly turn over. So there have been suggestions that maybe it's something more akin to a trade association. Something, though, that the players are behind and the people bargaining for them have their best interest at heart, right? So they bargain on their behalf. Now, there's also the problem on the other side. Who's bargaining for college football? Do you give that back to the NCAA? It'll be a cold day and you know where before they cede that power back to the NCAA, I think. Is it the college football playoff? Do they enhance their status? Is it a coalition of the conferences? What is it exactly? Who is it? What entity bargains on both sides? We don't even know that. But it's really the only way out because you have to have some type of structure where people decide here are the rules of engagement. Here are the contracts. I negotiate with Ryan McGee when I recruit him out. Where'd you go to high school? McGee High School?
Travers Rest. Travers Rest
Okay.
High School. Go Devil
Okay.
Dog.
Travers, when I recruit Ryan McGee out of Travers Rust High School, we negotiate. And Ryan, I'd like to sign you to a 3-year deal. I'd like for you to stay, here at this university for 3 years. You're like, I don't know. This money's not quite what I'd hoped for coming out. So what do you say to one? And we either settle on one or we settle on two and we get the money and you fulfill that contract. There are buyout provisions. If you say, you know what, I'm way better than you thought, Coach Davis, and I'm going here. And I say, that's fine, Ryan. But it says here in your contract, you owe me $750,000 payable immediately.
Yep.
Okay. And so you have some control over that. Or I can say, no, the contract says, this. It's all negotiated. And then there are rules and how the contracts can be negotiated. And there are salary guidelines or caps. And if I want to pay you $8 million, that means I have more or I have less for my left guard. And I have to figure it all out, just like what? The NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball, because this is a professional enterprise. Now it's what it is.
Yeah. And I'll say this too. So there are two takeaways I had from the postseason. And the first was, and this goes to, what's the reward if you're at the next level down? I was really encouraged by what we saw in the ball games. They were fun. Top to bottom, starting in the middle of December. I went to 2 of them, took my daughter to the Citrus Bowl, and that was encouraging to me because I think there's still a place for them. I think there should be a place for them. You still get a ring. You should be rewarded. Particularly those who are at the end of their college careers. That was great. The other part is everything we talk about all the time now is transactional football and transactional relationships. And, we focused, and rightly so, on Quinshon Judkins and Riley Leonard and, both quarterbacks. I mean, players that, had just arrived at these teams. But the team that I saw walking off the field and defeating Notre Dame, they were in it together. And the
Mm-hmm.
team that I saw celebrating, and those guys that I talked to on Saturday, and I've heard you talk several times over the last couple of days on this podcast and other avenues about everyone was so outwardly open about their faith and baptizing players in the apartment building and all these things. But there's still, I was really, really, and I've told everyone this that I've talked to, friend wise, family wise, whatever, that team still exists. Like that chemistry's there. And you had all these returning players at Ohio State and Notre Dame who have been there for several years, but then you also had all these guys that have just been there, since the spring. But I have been really encouraged this year, now that we're a few years into this NIL transfer portal mess, that those guys were in it together. And I think that bond will still exist. And I saw how they wanted to play for their coaches. And so I think people worry that all that is going to be completely ripped apart by everything that we're talking about. But the reality is, I mean, I don't know how you felt, but I walked away smiling about both teams because I thought, all right, this still feels like a football team. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't feel, NFL locker rooms are kind of a cold place.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what these locker rooms feel like. And a few years in, I was worried that's where we would be. And now I don't think that that's where we're headed, which makes me feel a lot better about everything.
You know what? I agree with you, and I think part of that is because you still have these are grown men, but they are still young men who are maturing, who still want those types of relationships, who, while, some of them have families, meaning children, for the most part, they are not so far along in their journey to adulthood as you would find in the NFL, where they're like, "Hey, man, got to protect my kids, got to create generational wealth." So there's a little bit of a difference. I think there's more of an opportunity to create that feeling that you're talking about. Doesn't mean it's easy to do, and it also has to be authentic and genuine, which was what impressed me the most. I think about the outward expressions of faith that both teams showed, and just the sort of, it was revival. It was like one of the old school tent revivals that you and I grew up with. And I say that with great admiration and affection for what happened at Ohio State and many campuses across the country. But certainly there, you saw a lot of it because several of their players were at the forefront of that. So those are types of things that I think all human beings are open to, but I think particularly people who are of that age, who are coming into a more mature level of adulthood, who are, in many cases, discovering their own faith as opposed to what, just, one of our campus minister used to say, God doesn't have grandchildren. He has children. So at some point you have to make your decision about your faith. And that often comes at the time in life where the Ohio State players were, and the Notre Dame players and all others too. But I think that was a profound thing, and it does speak to your thing of developing the chemistry necessary to have that feeling in the locker room, because you don't always get that even in college, and it takes leadership within the team. It takes leadership at the top. And while I admire when it is faith-based, it doesn't have to be that, but there has to be a common cause that most everybody buys into. Look, we're not naive. There was somebody in that Ohio State locker room unhappy. Not unhappy they won, but unhappy with his lot.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
he's
certainly,
gone,
yeah,
and that's fine, and that has
absolutely,
always existed. That has
yeah,
always existed.
always,
It just,
yeah,
right, but I just was what I was worried about not existing, and I think I just kind of fallen prey to all these. I'm so thankful that the season gets here because I get so tired of those other conversations. But even during the season, we were having them. But I just and I wrote the story on Sunday about Ohio State and Notre Dame both embracing the new business model, and that's
hmm,
particularly hard at a place like Notre Dame.
oh
But they
yeah,
did it.
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but they did it, and it's but I was really really encouraged by, and this wasn't just about those two teams. I saw it everywhere I was this
yeah,
fall, and so I was encouraged by that because I think you still want college football to feel like college football, and
hmm.
you still want the locker room to feel like the locker room, and you still want to see these kids because that's what they are, even though they're more grown up than they were when you and I were coming along. Um,
We'll agree to disagree there. I think they're adults, but I think they're
Yeah, no, no,
men.
no.
But so
But they're
yeah,
still 19,
yeah.
and I think that at the end of the day, to see them still bond over this and to see them, whether it's faith, whether it's motivation against their own fan base, whether it's just, playing for an injured friend, whatever it
Yeah,
is, it's encouraging to me that it's still there
I
because I
agree.
think there were a lot of people trying to sell us all that was going to go away, and
Yeah.
that's not. It certainly is that way some places, but for the most part, it's still. If it was a blind taste test and you didn't know all this was going on business wise, and you were just on the field for the confetti, then you would just it felt like it's supposed to feel, and that made
Mhm.
me feel good headed into the winter.
100%. Amen. Hey, let's have a couple of a quick category funds. Which player or coach had the most fun this year? What was the most fun story? Who had the most fun? I mean, Gene Stallings used to say, "Well, the fun's in the winning." So, I mean, the easy answer is Ohio State. Who do you think had the most fun?
Diego Pavia at
That's a good
Vanderbilt,
call. Yeah.
he is like he's a national hero, and now trying to do every and filling out paperwork to get to play more. I just and this, I'm the bottom 10 guy for ESPN.com. Diego's a guy I watched a lot,
Yeah.
but then started winning at a place that didn't win before, and then brought some of his teammates and with his former coach to Vanderbilt. And the moment of the season that I keep going back to is Vanderbilt. They have been 0 and 60 against top five teams. Finally won the game. Finally beat Alabama. The Vanderbilt students politely storming the field, like literally, it's almost in slow motion, climbing down in a stadium that's like half deconstructed right now. And I'll never forget it. That moment, and I've told Chris Doring this. He said this on SEC Network as we were all watching that live, and Chris Doring said, "We're in an era of football where the great teams maybe aren't as great as they used to be, but the bad teams certainly aren't as bad as they used to be." And to
Hmm.
me, Diego Pavia, that dude, and if you've ever seen his family tailgating, it's not just Diego. The Pavia, no one's having more fun than them. And so that's my vote.
I'll see your Pavia and I'll raise you. O T T T O G O, Jaden Otis ought to go. Snap and clap and hit the hole. Jaden Otis ought to go. Raise your hands to the house. It's ought to go. I think I messed it up at the end.
No, no,
Calgorithm,
that was
man.
good enough.
Calgorithm. I say it's the Calgorithm that had more fun than anybody this year. Um, Give me the one thing that you didn't see coming that happened.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of games we didn't see coming. That kind of 2007 level of every single time we thought, okay, Alabama's going now, and then they lost. Oh, Georgia's rolling now, and then they lost. So
Mhm.
that I did not see that dominoes. Like I didn't see a 2007 level of no one kind of wanted to be at the top. And
Mhm.
the other part I didn't see coming, quite honestly, was I spent all fall in the SEC, and everyone kept trying to sell me on Carson Beck, Jalen Milroe, Nico, Ewers, these guys as like the modern version of, you know, give me whatever era of greatest SEC quarterbacks of all time, Peyton Manning, whatever else. I didn't see it. And
Yeah.
and I like all those guys, but it just didn't when I watched those guys, I didn't see, a Shane Matthews versus Peyton Manning thing going on. I just
Mhm.
didn't see it. And as a result, I think that was the SEC's biggest problem this year. They just didn't have leadership under center, like they've had in the past. But that's what I didn't see. I thought we would see hopefully more parity in football, like I was just talking about. But I didn't see Arizona State, Indiana, and no
Mhm.
one being the greased pole factor of everybody trying to hang on to the number one spot in the country.
That's probably the biggest thing I didn't see coming was the volcanic eruption of Indiana and Arizona State going from awful to awesome in 1 year. And the flip side of that I certainly didn't see coming was I knew Florida State might be a little vulnerable, even though I picked them. I picked them to
Yeah.
go into the playoff, and now that we're at the end of the season, I'm going to be completely honest. I don't think I ever really believed it, but I thought, well, they got a lot of guys back, and I thought they might sneak in, especially based on last year. Instead, they went the other way. The complete meltdown. Uh, of their program to the point where you almost feel like they need a rebuild.
Yep.
1 year after an undefeated regular season is, I certainly didn't see that coming. And quickly as we wrap, what are you looking forward to next year? Because week 0 in Farmageddon in Dublin will be here before we know it.
Which,
That's Iowa State and Kansas State, by the way.
by the way, Farmageddon in the land of Pete Moss is the greatest thing of all time, right? I just,
Yeah, yeah.
I just love that. But that I honestly hadn't looked at the 2025 schedule because I wanted to get this season over with. But when I got back to the room and I was so wired on Monday night, slash Tuesday morning, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna look. And that first 2 weekends, we made such a big deal out of the schedule this year in the first couple of weekends, that opening weekend in particular, week 1. This is that and more. I mean, it's every bit of it. So that part of it, and I just I'm looking forward to not knowing what's happening, and I hope that we get as much of that this fall as we did last fall, because I don't, you know, chalk is boring, and so I'm all about upsets and people being stressed and all that, and but just if we have even 50% of the unpredictable drama this year that we had last year, then I'm all for it. But I'm just week 1's gonna be great. Now that being said, I need a nap, and I know you do. I know Pete does. That's why he's not here right now. But I could use a nap, and then we can get to what is hopefully an insane week 1.
Let's run down just a few of those. Texas at Ohio State, presumably the starting, well, not the starting debut, but the debut as full-time QB1 of Arch Manning. Notre Dame at Miami. LSU at Clemson, the real Death Valley on the line.
Love it.
Alabama at Florida State. New quarterback, and really, I think that will be the first year for Kalen DeBoer, really, because this year was sort of a transition year. Bill Belichick's debut against TCU. Orange versus Orange in Atlanta. Syracuse and Tennessee. Auburn's at Baylor. There, there's a lot to be looking forward to once it rolls around. But in the meantime, we've got a full basketball season ahead. We've got a lot of other great events in the middle, and we'll be around from time to time as news breaks to get you up to date on that with emergency podcasts and various conversations with coaches and players throughout the offseason. Ryan, this has been a lot of fun this year. Appreciate your contributions to the podcast all year.
No, it's been great, and it's been fun to be involved in the TV show on Saturdays, and it has truly been a listen. You're talking about shortening the schedule a little bit. I think we're all tired. It's a weird thing when your rhythm gets messed with, and having just finished college football as we're talking on the 22nd of January. But it's as tired as I've been at the end of the season, but I've never had more fun, and that has to do with working with you and working with Pete, but it also has to do with the season that we just got to cover.
It was great, and I'll be moving on to see your beloved Big Orange down on the plains on Saturday in what will be an epic Final Four level type of game. Auburn's a little beat up basketball wise. Hope Janai Broome can get back quickly. They're the best team I've seen. Tennessee's awfully good too, so looking forward to that. And
Basketball
we'll
school.
talk
What if you
some
heard? Yeah,
hoops.
Auburn, Tennessee basketball schools. Yeah,
Apparently, I think,
yeah.
well, that's the funniest thing is because, hey, look, the Big Ten earned every bit of their bragging rights in football this year, but the SEC, they'll have to pay it off in the tournament. But the regular season, dominating the rankings, winning non-conference games, SEC has been dominant. I said I do think one more basketball note will go. Here's my prediction for the SEC in basketball. Somebody is going to go 0 for February. And because every game I saw, I've forgotten which team it was, but there's a schedule out there among one of the contenders that every game left on their schedule is a quad one game. And for those who follow basketball, that they have a system that determines kind of ranks your schedule, and quad one is the ultimate. It's against a top 30 team at home, top 50 team, neutral site, and top 75 if you're on the road. I think I have the numbers right. Every game left on the schedule is a quad one game. And that's true for a lot of the SEC teams. So my prediction is, Ryan, that somebody who's already built a really nice resume up to this point is going to pretty much go 0 for February. They're going to sneak in the tournament as a 10 seed, probably have to maybe even have 10 or 11, maybe have to play in Dayton, and they're going to go to the Final Four because they're going to get hot.
Yeah.
There's that level of depth. And it's like, in some ways, they have to pay it off to prove to be this good, but it's almost like those old Big East days when all of those teams that would go to New York for the Big East tournament, you're like, well, okay, I know they're the 5th seed in the Big East, but they might win the national championship. And I think you're going to see a lot of that this year.
NC State 83. How about Virginia, Olden, Polynice, right?
Yeah. The year after Ralph Sampson.
Exactly. No,
how about the year after Ralph Sampson, Virginia goes. The year after Dominique Wilkins,
yep.
Georgia goes.
83,
yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean,
there you go. So I'll take all of those and more. Thank you very much.
Yeah. That'll tide us over until we get to that great week 1 in college football. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. We encourage you to subscribe or download wherever you prefer to get your podcast. And soon you will get an episode that will arrive right on your device if you subscribe, and you will hear the dulcet tones of Pete Thamel once his voice has been restored to its proper glory.